The self does not exist. Two reasons. First is ontology. The ego is a social conquest to reject notions of individual self-grounded on morality and fundamental unity of living things. Smart 9 explains. Self-realization requires shedding the ego and reducing one's self-zero as the ego itself loosens one deep into the realization of what authentic ego self-identities. The ego is socially constructed, ultimate fabrication of discursive forms of culture, intentionally presupposes to pre-intentional awareness to be conscious of one has to be conscious of one's consciousness effects, and one would have to be one's conscious of one's conscious ad infinitum. Therefore, there must be a level of awareness pre-discursive when the ego is shed. The non-positional self-awareness is revealed. Pre-discursive self-awareness is unified and independent with all things. Living things shared humanity is based on a common level of being. The essence of morality rests upon an awareness of our fundamental interconnection. Second is epistemology. Perception is shaped by the flow of experiences, means there's no autonomous self which can engage in objective a priori reason. Macy 79 explains the self is shaped by the flow of experience, possesses no I. The self does not have an experience. The problem with the mindness is considering itself independent and autonomous entity. Perception is a two-way street involving convergence of sensory signals with attention and a mental contract imposed by the perceiver. Since thought co-arises from perception, a priori reasoning, suspect, proliferation, contemplation, and turn the world we see, we create our world, but not unilaterally, for consciousness is colored by the by which we feed. The ethical implications are several. All theories are speculation, are contingent, are theorizing, neither objective nor but relative constructs which bear our moral responsibility. Because the self does not exist, we feel a sense of blackness, underlies insatiable greed for wealth, and the power which reinforces separation between the world. Buddhism is key to challenge this separation. Lloyd 10 explains, since the sense of self is a mental construct, an ungrounded one, insecure sense of self shadowed by a lack. We identify with things outside. We crave money, material possession, reputation, power, because we misunderstand how our essential lack as due to lack of things. No matter how much money I accumulate, I never seem to have enough. The tragedies that attempt to end up reinforcing the problem. The sense that there's a me, separate from the other. Buddhist solution is to see through the illusion of self. I'm not inside, peering out from an objective world. I am one of the ways in which the world causes of the world come together. We feel distant from the world. We realizing my non-duality with the world frees me to live in a way that contributes to the well-being of the whole. Thus, the standards consistency with the spiritual world. First, reason to prefer first economics. Traditional economic theory relies on scientifically bankrupt understanding of the person. Buddhist understanding of the person is essential to enlightenment. This also clarifies my standard Tideman 4 explains Buddhist traditions describe in reality in different terms than traditional economic theory. In economic textbooks, humans are isolated consumers, producers driven by monetary gains. Spiritual traditions, humans are a large part of a holistic viewpoint is led by physics. I to discover that to know things, we need to know how the whole from which they originate. We are like every energy flows continuously interrelating. Most economic strategies are built around the assumption that land, labor, and capital is all there is. Spiritual traditions can claim the opposite. They recognize the ultimate potential of to be a whole and enlightened. A Buddhist approach to economics which rejects greed solves extinction. Solzhenitsyn 11 explains Buddhism suggests an approach to economic life is radically different from the mainstream Western economics. Ecological financial crisis renders alternative solutions worthy for consideration. The fundamental cause is the investors feel by a responsible financial institution. The present scale of economic activities is ecologically unsustainable. According to legislative data, in most industrialized countries are ecologically overshot by 250 to 600% of frugality is crucial for our survival. And second is happiness. Buddhist enlightenment is key to true happiness and liberation from impulses. Tideman 4 explains real happiness does not come from a quiet, consuming happiness, a state of mind, and a mind is distinct from matter. What matters is strife to liberation, enlightenment, which is the ultimate state of happiness. The woman wants only this will bring true happiness for the individual society. Experts agree. A Buddhist approach to ethics and economics key to reducing suffering. Solzhenitsyn 11 explains GDP doubled or tripled, and Western but general habits remain the same. Nature determined happiness, not abundance, but equality. Human relations, spiritual approach to mental material wealth. Buddhists perform well in Bhutan introduces gross national happiness. Experts attribute the adoption of GNH to the well-being of people. Increase the Buddhist ethical principles application of economic life can contribute to reduction of suffering in the world. I contend that Buddha would want just governments to require employers to pay a living wage. Living wage index of cost of living. LWAC 6 explains a living wage is a decent wage that affords an earner and her or his family the most basic cost of living without a need for government support. Wage share according to location and cost vary. A living wage puts federal poverty on takes into account the necessary factors in calculating actual cost in specific geographic area. They continue brackets for numbering. The 7 factors in calculating basic costs are 1. Housing, 2. Food, 3. Childcare, 4. Transportation, 5. Healthcare, 6. Taxes, and 7 other basic necessities. I will defend any advocacy that meets this definition of living wage. If you want me to specify further, that doesn't contradict to the AC. I will defend it. You can check and see if you like, but it's not mandatory. And reasonability is defined as in-round abuse is key to theory abuse, which moves my one seed to start topic institution competing in terms of screws us because the risk of 0.001% risk of offense is sufficient to pull the trigger that something might be abusive policy debate. Proves reasonability is an effective norm. No link to intervention because you can weigh as norms versus my theory abuse offense. Intervention is also inevitable in Blivy theory based IO and magnitude because there's a larger problem in intervention in status quo contention. First, economic activities should be moderate, also known as the middle path. Fulfillment of basic needs is good, greed is not. Nishikawa 13 explains today's Western way of life, which pursues constantly at capital accumulation, consumption is based on ecocentric principles that tend to multiply one's greed by living by countries that suggest not to multiply, but to simplify or desires everything. The world based on dependent origination. Our economic activities should be therefore moderate. If after fulfillment of basic needs, we should curb our greed. And a living wage ensures that poor can fulfill their basic needs and it values them. Unknown Buddhist 13 explains living wage are important because when you make 25,000 a year, one typically spends almost all income on food and shelter. I question how much we really value our employees when we can't agree that people have the right to a living wage. We must reverse the reverence of money. This also answers back how arguments about employment. It's a question of it's a question of how much we pay them, not how many are employed. And employees are paid at a low wage because their employees have failed to recognize the fundamental unity between people. The most concept of right and livelihood requires wages to be fair. Ross 12 explains the fundamental problem for humanity is that you believe that you are here and I'm there. This is something how Buddhists cast a critical eye on people in commercial enterprises as we long as we are not as others and not as humans, but the other. We will suffer abuse in the workplace. Employers will steal their workers' wages from a Buddhist perspective. It's not enough to say that we are our brother's keeper. We need to feel that we are actually our brother. From this, fair treatment follows naturally. Buddhists call this right and livelihood work on everyone being treated fairly. And Buddhist monks agree in Cambodia there are many monks in solidarity with low-wage workers because they recognize the fundamental unity between people. Larson 14 explains Bhutan. A 34-year-old Cambodian monk has regularly possessions. I but found I am an SAJ to mobilize Cambodian monks to press for the economic reforms defending before he dispatched monk reporters to post on information for union strikes to raise minimum wage. We aren't supposed to just care about money. He jokes, but the suffering of ordinary people is suffering monks and people living in hardship situation can do little to help themselves. And as an underview, Advocates RVIs in theory because self-forcing transcript means I need to be able to collapse in my rebuttal speeches in order to have a chance at winning access to ballot. Otherwise, it's just a nib for me. And reading one error theory is not strategic because the time crunch one error makes it so that I can't develop my arguments.
Everyone could go see it?
Yeah.
Alright, so in order to, can I turn the app by saying that you make people worse off? Would Buddha not like that?
Yeah, you could. I mean, you have to answer the indicts to like unemployment not linking, right?
Right. But, so what if the argument is not unemployment? What if I have a disadvantage that people get worse off in other ways? Is that like the case?
So this AC is specifically about the relationship between the employer and employee, so I wouldn't think that applies.
So, do consequences link the case? I.e., does Buddha care about what happens when we try to help people?
I mean, don't take a stance on that. I mean, you can make arguments for why the consequences are relevant.
Okay. So, what is a living wage for the analysis of contention?
It's whatever LWAC defines it to be.
It seems your authors seem to refer to a living wage as a universal wage form. Is that correct?
Sorry, what?
Your authors seem to refer to a living wage as a universal wage form. Is that correct?
Well, it's indexed to cost of living when considered.
Yeah, but it is a universal wage form. Even though it's indexed to cost of living, it applies to everyone.
Like,
right?
what do you mean? Like, yeah, it's like a price. Like, you have to pay someone a certain amount of money.
Right, for all employers, correct?
Yeah, like unless you want to.
So, do you compare between the pieces of contention level offense?
No, not really.
Okay. So, how would you compare between someone being harmed, i.e., not having enough money to put food on their table, and solidarity between the employer and employee?
So I think the arguments you can make are probably about how one is a direct harm and one is an indirect harm. Other arguments you can make are just like strength of like the basic way arguments everyone makes.
So let's talk about unknown Buddhist 13. Why does that answer unemployment?
So unknown Buddhist 13 explains like what the relevant consideration of the app is. Like it's not about how like someone is employed, but rather how the employer sees their employee. So when I give you 50 cents an hour, I see you as an other, and I don't care about you. Which Buddha would say is bad because that doesn't recognize the interconnected nature of individuals.
What does it mean to be interconnected?
It means that my experiences are necessarily intertwined with yours, so I cannot say that I have these absolute rights because you and I are the same.
Okay. So, let's talk about the argument in Ross. Can you explain the warrant in Ross?
Yeah, sure. So the argument is that when you say that they don't deserve a living wage and you're like, oh, I'm going to give them 50 cents an hour, you do not see them as another human being because you don't give them the basic courtesy of like having enough money to buy food.
Your Ross card and Larson card seems to say that people need to give them a fair wage. Why does that mean they need a living wage?
A living wage is a fair wage. It's like literally what you need to survive.
Where's that analysis in the app?
I think that's pretty intuitive.
Yep. Can you use scrubs? Yep. 4 minutes starting now.
Yeah, drop the number.
Can you call Buddhism spiritual?
Wait, what?
Can you call Buddhism spiritual?
I wouldn't call it a religion, no.
Well, I know. What would you call it spiritual?
I think it's a philosophy we take when you when we approach life.
Consider your standard as consistency with the spiritual world.
Right, but I think that's pretty semantic. Like, it's not like, oh, we should worry about like random spirits or ghosts or something. No, it's a little more nuanced than that.
Well, I'm not interpreting as random spirits.
Okay.
or is Q off AC? Interpretation affirmative cannot be religious framework read a standard of consistent with the spiritual world or read a spiritual framework or framework branding theology or spiritual way of life thinking they must have anything of your spiritual way of life as a framework around these violation you are produced you cannot be my interpretation. I'm literally saying it cannot be your standard text or even if you place semantic games to say that Buddha is not a religion, you will always violate my interpretation. See, our standards A is judgment mention you, cause mention one because judges know more about this particular religion than you, allow the verse to be done around which we say are more likely to be for the religion. Second, because intervention against it, people are hardcore against it. You can see on Michael Krentz, and my Michael Krentz straight with this low judgment right now, which means you, there's controversy community likely to introduce judgment to take red and judgment to take fairness, ensure that our arguments being around our value information now, and people say someone means inclusivity, your interpretation feels inclusivity, they run people that actually believe in the way of life and not want to contradict the framework, also limits my ability to respond to it. I have full solidarity with my religious beliefs and religious beliefs and religion is specifically backward inclusivity, even if I can't make arguments, I risk damning myself or harming myself or going against my beliefs. Inclusivity and fairness ensures that people can engage in discussion around me. I'll get to the voter for the second challenge. Interpretation, new market habits by the living wage work consistently mandated that this is under controversy or in some cases even consistency of estimated workers wage sufficient work and should be this violation of living wage and minimum wage for the same policies the after key market. Minimum wage laws establish standard for living wage apply to all employees for specified jurisdiction as not indexed market wage. Living wage policy set an absolute minimum standard that only apply to employees with public controversy. Public money is there are more different than living wage policy the way living mandated that is the exact show for governorship easy violence interpretation revenue processing solution with clear you get a minimum wage to everyone with the living wage is very will apply to a subset of firms. Violence the also is solvency violence that we want a living wage to apply to all people to show that there's full solidarity. You can't be my interpretation, see a standard, but standard is the autonomous. My interpretation most actively finds terms of rest. One, my there's various types of wage for policy showing top to the entire population of the mark. You have to look at the top giver to find a rate of the living wage repeated 12 years return. Active interpretation topic 3 is static. Retain repeated the interest, most recent offer 3 dead 2013 living. Wage has between 1 to 2 types of person, most valuable types of contract with or more this covers 27% contract communities will govern the second one really important. This applies open private citizenship and guidelines for support the city government to economic city fairness and education which what the terms of resolution be less by the ground top of the truth be individual ground. My interpretation only way by the ground authors recognize that the living wage requires years to chart teach outside of minimum wage law New York matters. Well, traditional minimum wage legislation dealing universal covers living wage apply to substantive verbs less the restoration effect shows minimum wage law the extent of period religion that testing traditional most service by 5% effect living wage there the increase requires separate group examination of not keep fairness and risk but identify those on the side top view record on top D for fairness this work is basically that activity based on skill moves losses community interpretation what is reasonably begs what's the required arbitrary measure judgment about around still turns is reasonably Browning he says in Browning's in round views that begs the question what is actually in round views so second reasonability causes a race the law of first grade massively reasonable philosophy he says theory debate is bad the only way we can avoid theory debate is not community interpretation shows that people actually fall fair norm to discourage these facts that incentivize theory debate drop very one theory because otherwise no sense stopping these arguments key fairness ensures that theory is capable of setting norms to activity second drop theory is abuse strategic debates in the case of multiple abuse arguments for supporting that one theory against the aggressive moving around and no guarantee because those theory interpretation will only be dropping your arbitrary third drop your third not running theory against the top down against the advocacy entire framing of the round because you can't drop your argument if you reject the advocacy through any theory shows you that he cannot win the round no RBI one because potentially if my theory would not initiate my point not for RBI keepers and I have to have access to the review the second obvious play cherry turn gameless counterpretation of 3 there's no one rounds to be for educational 3 RBI is way also to the education they force randomly assign on the 7 having risk going back and some then walking the story of discussion topic 4th RBI's the first way to make the run piece of the position be rewarded for the B system we seen this run I Drew was explicitly avoiding my question whether or not it was a religious frame that he read so he knew that his frame was very his case was susceptible to this theory interpretation go to the abstract of the RBI arguments in the bottom of the affirmative case 1 for you have access to the affirmative case continue left hand to your own slide you know emphasizing that you can't expect your position second term you have to figure out all and whenever I go to collapse solve and actually you can spend 3 minutes on the most important issue by leverage and third term the one area quickly does solve but I have a good example of this you could open up new layers in one area and solve that from times 3 4th times 2 if you're ducked out in terms of all your time just to spend time making over your designation with the round or making over the fit there's no brother for when times 2 comes to be so always for my section will always a bachelor and chilling friend close to the cherry went off the counter interpretation then go through is CI checks arguments group CI checks don't use CI checks one turns back for advocacy skills his first experience with defend their own position instead you can see what their opponent says second turn it perhaps a very high use of arguments instead these arguments if you have a north CI checks increase instead of high use to extend to the next week so the opponent can have that risk of winning off the third turn is back for reciprocal evidence this means the evidence applies to everything by force we can see the specific advocacy will lie but it only applies to what I'm simply dying with the always has a huge future advantage from superior Senko, the street building Riley first, reject violence, they put a necessary with future burden on the negative last answer, falls Riley to he wins the theory, he wins any one of them. Second, I show through my interpretation whether it's in-ground abuse, I is in-ground intervention, my inclusivity also because he is in top field 3. Next question, what in-ground abuse between philosophy abuse and abuse with Riley go to? Invention. Turn the living minimum wage also cause random employment in class economy. This worship affects the worst off. And critical study goes negative. Listen, all comes to the eventually change the dollar higher than the cost of minimum wage increase. You may find the comment from research last 7 years that minimum wage laws tend to reduce employment. If the article in Washington compensate tends to review more than 100 minimum wage studies. The Congress affects one too. This one affects more than 85% of those critical studies point to the negative employment effects of the studies. Federal only still are most likely to be adversely affected by minimum wages and unemployment control strongly to poverty, even for economic and social affairs. Unemployment lies support by the poor labor resulting in the asset use and group developing hence the creation of employment opportunities set for poverty reduction and same economic social development. Cut the card there. This also answers for unemployment. He says that people have to be able to provide themselves. It says that unemployment doesn't link to that ability for provision, but unemployment is the root cause of poverty, which means even wage slightly increase that there's more poverty than multi permanents. People are unable to provide themselves. Third, and it's really second term, the minimum wage forces employers to cut their benefits and increasing poverty. Fraser, employers cut back around less for the on-the-job training and non-wage benefits, give employee priority to most productive experience workers involved. Those work for minimum wage, not actually on low income households. This also turns to arguments that solidarity employers who have solidarity with workers who instead of engaging in recognizing work as equal, they cut out their benefits to them because of right wage and waste. Also, waste, he says that we shouldn't have fixation of money, but he forces to be more fixated on money. Money trumps all the benefits of the way it is. Well, we should cut cause other things like training cuts. So he has more fixation money. In addition, for my unemployment, unemployment over solidarity, one denies that there is solidarity between workers and employers. We pass laws that cause unemployment. That denies that people are failing to create hostility between the two. Second, we know that there's going to be unemployment caused by the wage, which means we know the policy not going to solidarity or good intended for we've seen pure cross, which is third, people are cut up from the spiritual realm. They are very extreme poverty. There's no way for them to interact with their spiritual selves, which is the most severe link about spirituality. Spirit poverty you can get.
Okay, what were the texts of your interpretation, of your religion interpretation?
The theory in church was that you cannot read a religious framework or a standard, read your standard text, or a spiritual framework, or a theological or spiritual framework, a framework that's theological or deals with a spiritual way of life.
Okay, so which part of the abuse talks about the spiritual aspect of your interpretation? It seems like all of your abuse comes from religious arguments.
Well, all the arguments come back to it pretty
quickly. Where do you prove that a spiritual approach, like a philosophy of like Buddhism, causes intervention?
Now, just way inclusivity, because anyone who's truly a Buddhist or follows any.
Well, what if I'm a Democrat? Then I'm like,
I made the analysis that is different.
Why?
Because for them to give a spiritual belief, there can be a consequence of not following it. You could feel like you've done a moral wrong to yourself. Whereas a Democrat.
Okay. So where did you prove Buddhism specifically, says there's a moral wrong for doing so?
Sure. I mean, that you should threaten the entire year frame. It'd be wrong not to follow Buddhism.
So, reading frameworks is bad?
No, Drew, you're misunderstanding my argument. My argument is that when you introduce a framework that is a way of life for people, or a philosophy of living, they have a special attachment to that. That is a moral philosophy of their own, or their own ethical outlook, which is different from their political beliefs. So it kills their conclusion.
Okay, so it's their moral and ethical outlook. So if I read a Kant framework and I'm a Kantian, doesn't that seem to bite in just as hard?
I think it is distinct, given that religious arguments and spiritual arguments have some degree of punishment for not abiding by them. And I make that analysis in the standard. You feel moral damnation, there could be a problem for the afterlife, etc. So that's one way in which it's distinct for inclusivity. And also, the interpretation wouldn't exclude Kantianism.
I think I'm pretty spiritual about Kant, but let's talk about the next interpretation. So this refers to living wage ordinances. Where in the resolution is the word ordinance?
Sure. Living wages have always been implemented as ordinances. So even though it's not in the resolution, it's a term of art.
Wait, what? Why is that true? Where do you get it from?
When a resolution says a government ought to pass X policy, it doesn't include federal government, it's a federal policy.
Wait, okay.
The living wage is a municipal policy, so it doesn't say ordinances. And I say the fact that so it doesn't have to say ordinances.
Okay, what's the violation for this interpretation?
Sure. The violations are discussion across examination, where you said that the living wage is a universal wage for it applies to everyone. Also,
right, but if it's specific to cost of living, how does it violate?
No, Drew, you're misunderstanding. My argument is that you said the minimum is a higher minimum wage that goes to everyone. That violates the interpretation because the living wage only applies to governmental contractors or people receiving funding from the city. Okay,
so, all right, that's fine. What's the
and
second?
Also, your solvency law, there's a point to
What's the second reason for why poverty turns the app? Or the first and second?
With these two arguments I read at the end.
Yeah.
Sure. The first argument is that poverty and unemployment denies a person's spiritual connection because it creates a hostile environment between workers and employers. The second argument is that we've known in the past that there have been problems with unemployment empirically when we have a living wage or have minimum wage, which denies that the intention of the action is to help promote solidarity and live more of a middle life. And the third argument is that you deny access to the spiritual world of people who are impoverished.
Wait, so sorry. Well, could you actually wait. What was the exact interpretation? Text of the first interpretation?
Creators cannot read a religious framework, a standard of standard text, a spiritual framework, or any spiritual or theological way of life for standard framework.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mr. Alder. So your interpretation says that the people who get the living wage have to be somehow related to the city, right?
Well, not just related. They have to receive funding from
Got
the city or be in contract with the city government.
Yeah, thanks.
You flash the readings that we need.
Yeah. One error Sems. New off, then the off. New off, and then the off in the order he read them, and then AC. This is ever good. Good, Mr. Roper. Interpretation. All planks of a theory interpretation must be justified by some link to a standard in the theory chart to clarify. This means planks may not be arbitrary violation. His interpretation is specifically about how religious arguments are bad, not about how spiritual philosophy are bad. He says there might be like a bad consequence of not saying consistent with Buddhism. That's bullshit because all of his there's nothing about like damnation in the AC. Also, either the way he explains his interpretation was that if it's your moral and ethical outlook on life, then it means that it's about your moral and ethical outlook on life. And that would mean that any philosophy in the AC would be a violence interpretation, but he arbitrarily excludes them. The standard is turned around because my ability to contest their interpretation of the arbitrary blanks, i.e. they said the violence shows the two, they can stand up saying they're interpreting specifically not them, or if they're or it's excluding this specific term, this arbitrary language excluded I means and counter interpretation because the text theory interpretation is what dictates offense. Goes under interpretation. There's no risk theory. I shoot for the theory initiated. If I don't catch it, to abuse the text theory interpretation. I do catch it. All that happens is I put a flaw in their interpretation, but it's only deep because it means that part of your interpretation is not in its instance. Offense is served by instance. Offense is served by the interpreter. Here's my ability to make offense arguments. Served my ability to generate offense. So you can key the theory there. They're the one who just the highest layer for me. I can contest on the same level. This also this means the voter fairness because it's a question of me having ground in order to answer back his interpretation. Also, it precedes his interpretation because it means it's a question of the structure of his interpretation and it's my inability to contest it. Even if competing interpretation is true, then this prima facie has to come first. Next, go to the Buddhism bad interpretation. Counter interpretation. I may read a Buddhist a framework of Buddhist philosophy of spiritualism. Base violation. I make Buddhism is everything but a religion. Westerners just like to attach names to it. Gash 10 explains. No, credo deities never mentioned. Can there be religion about God theology about theos? And since Buddhists clearly opposed the priestly task, one might even take a case that religion of no religion. There's nothing to convert from being a Jew, Christian, Muslim does not change. The Buddha's essential teaching the nature of human suffering is called spirituality. Distinct from religion, Buddha is a physically embodied metaphysics with a deep psychology, comparative deep psychology. This solves the entirety of these views because it's nothing to do with your beliefs, but just a question of how you view suffering. For example, in the AC, all of the framework justifications were reasons as to why I would not adopt a Buddhist philosophy leads to suffering in the world, which means that there's nothing but impartiality. In fact, these arguments are definitely not unique because the way that he explained them was that he would exclude they would exclude consciousness because that's an outlook or a more ethical outlook of life, which means it's his. If it's true that Buddhism violates his interpretation, the disadvantage to his interpretation is literally excluding every philosophy and making it so that there can be no philosophical discussion, which is linked to education because because it teaches how to be people in real life and making normative decisions. Also teaches voter because while we hold many years from now, even if fairness is a good thing, it's outweighed by the fact that actually it's not. Also, this links to ground because it means that a protocol does not have the ability to advocate any sort of philosophy. Then go to the next interpreter. Counter-interpretation, the Afghan federal living a national living wage policy indexed locally to cost of living. The idea a living wage can be applied internationally or nationally. Sure, 12 living wage orders applied to employers with local and state governments. Contracts a national federal living wage is ongoing. Current federal minimum does not meet the family for. Exempted by HHS. Even if this is true, specific to the federal government's reasons as to why ordinances is not specific to the topic literature because it's about just governments, meaning a sort of international sphere. You should provide interpretation first. Real-world education. A, there are evidences in the context of living wage ordinances, but ignores there are evidence of federal wage living wage. Beyond those, that's the Sherm 12 evidence is also answers back his claim that his interpretation is all there, that they claim he'll make, that his interpretation is what's commonly used, because obviously it's not. That's in the context when we advocate for things. B, multi-city is utopian, tons of city, never acted in utopia in unison. For example, that would mean I get fiat in different countries across the nation, a living wage policy, which is an abuse of multi-active fiat, which leads to fairness, because we can't make coherent responses to my advocacy, because there's so many, he gets to fiat away harms. For example, the two cities might have disputes over real education and voter entrance first. It's the only portable school we have, which will help us. There's no reason to evaluate something unless there's an educational benefit to it, because that has no application to our round two. It's ground, or actually, this side for
116. So why do I have an unwarranted language?
Because you say no standard of spiritual Buddhism. And my argument is that none of your standards justify that, because they're all about religious aspects and views of life, and the way you explain the interpretation means that this definitely doesn't bind into your view story, so it's arbitrary.
Do you read the ground argument in your counter interpretation?
To living wage ordinances?
Yeah.
No.
shell. After that, totality, and then spiritual shell. I might switch the order of those actually, but at his shell, we'll sign this one. Are we good to go? Extend the analysis of rules of the Afro level limit, extend the United Nation part, this is the root cause of poverty, extend this turns not waste the app. You takes up to all I have to do is be back and meta theory shell. There's no RBI in the last feature, so this is going to be an easy neck battle. Go to his shell. Counter interpretation, I may arbitrary unworded blanks, but my interpretation is go to his interpretation first. On your interpretation, I mean your interpretation. My blanks are not unwarranted, they're just poorly warranted. Heroes no distinction, even if he never explains why they're unwarranted. I say, so let's go through each argument. The first argument is that a judge might believe in Buddhism. That's true. By cause intervention, it's not a great one. The second argument is the judge might believe against Buddhism or any sort of theism. Also true, poorly warranted. The third argument is that someone might feel punished if they didn't go against Buddhism. They might feel some sort of moral destitute. That's a very bad warrant, but it's in the theory interpretation. You never explain why I don't have warrants. I just have 4 warrants, which means I can meet your interpretation. Obviously, your turn down first it's all down a counter interpretation. If I have arbitrary claims that you violate, but you meet all the non-arbitrary claims in the interpretation, your counter interpretation should be all the non-arbitrary claims in the interpretation, showing that you solve the abuse. What this looks like, if I have a bunch of planks in my interpretation that he meets in one arbitrary plank that he violates, his counter interpretation should be all the planks he meets and show that there's no offense to the one he violates. This solves for all the abuse means he can kick out of the theory second term. Your interpretation is bad. You destroy your prediction theory because you can run this theory shell whenever you disprove the warrants and the theory interpretation. The third term here causes a large amount of frivolous theory to engage theory debate. Your normative theory I am running on theory on the complexity interpretation discouraged. Long-term normative T sets us up that a change comes first, which means we want to avoid this. Fourth, I mean solve. And for the abuse, it's true that I have arbitrary complex my interpretation. You show what you need. The interpretation you need. The spirit of the interpretation please you need solve. The entire abuse fifth term you cause a showing effect against running with the showing effect against running against abuse strategies. His abuse things is hard to praise interpretation because things like skeptical you choose, you can show why my interpretation you're actually fall for the abuse for the sixth term, your turn down becomes really good. If my interpretation is arbitrary, you can say that's a reason to reject my interpretation because your turn down becomes really good. Also, this turn down outweighs it can be a meta frame you show in the theory debate. You can show if there's an arbitrary length interpretation that's on base, reason to reject my rule, which means you have an active layer turn down that I can't access, so I have to prove that I have non-arbitrary lengths before you engage in theory debate, which means you'll always have the advantage of using arbitrary lengths, so you'll have an advantage. Let's go to the T shell. Extend the New York Times interpretation living wage ordinance only by the government contracts in violation of the living wage as a universal wage form. You can see field context and game over. Extend my interpretation best one is compared between multiple wage form policies. Your counter interpretation just says a living wage. The living wage we apply nationally, but never compares a living wage to a living wage to a minimum wage. My interpretation was best. Also extended number 2 that New York Times was the best authors because they wrote about living wage over they've been 8 hours to a period of 12 hours. Author qualifications come first in the terms whether or not they're in the top wage in the first place. This is a game over issue. If he doesn't have a qualified author, because we never look through his interpretation, I can't access all the ground and then extend the analysis of DevOps. My interpretation is static. He only reads one definition in terms of all the DevOps shows that my interpretation has been static from 2003 to 2013. Also, DevOps most cases have been showing that even if there was an attempt at a federal minimum wage that has stopped these DevOps, it's explicit that the only type of living wage policies that exist are mutual. Extend that through the context of in terms of what in terms of resolution mean and how we rely on ground field context. Also, in terms of strong central link to ground army specific, because because also the solution right, but what is most field contextual, most accurate interpretation. Also, field context that weighs on jurisdiction in case arguments are not field contextual, then they're not depending what the resolution said. In the first place, we give no good value arguments. This means even though I'm utopian or unrealistic, doesn't matter. That just means our resolutions were badly because we're bad. The negative counter-interpretation group is we will arguments and utopian arguments. First is these advantages to counter-interpretation are non-unique. We'd be avoiding municipal policy. We'd be avoiding municipal policy. We'd be avoiding the federal government, avoiding the federal government, municipalities. There's no. That's the second term is less realistic to focus on a country. Is less likely that countries like North Korea and the United States work together. We'd rather focus on cities within the United States to be more likely to pass living wages. Third term empirically verify that multiple cities will pass a living wage. Living wage ordinances haven't passed, which means it's not utopian fiat. Fourth, it's also in this topic. People just won't run theory on utopian fiat against the whole rest aspect that the resolution is so vague, saying just governments will go just governments will split the cost. So this topic solves for utopian fiat. Fifth, my interpretation is most realistic. Cross-fight analysis of Newmark maps and fiction grounded. Only to realistically engage the topic is the living wage and living wage as separate distinct policies because they require empirical evaluation. Also, work is an awesome literature showing why it's the only way to realistically evaluate the topic. Initially, totality outweighs his interpretation. What does top down is a question of jurisdiction. If I am top down, then you can evaluate me saying the first place is he giving me top last second. If I conclude he's not top, then I that force me to be abusive, and that force me to abuse in the round, so off the top down, what concludes third. This theory interpretation is only run on the first theory shell, which means he has no disadvantage in negating the top down shell, which means his meta theory willing link cannot will apply top down. He also outweighs on strength of link. You see the deals wrong class, which means my top down interpretation always has the strongest strength link. Go to the religious intro. It's also extended variance majority based on some wins and losses. They say you drop for your further reason. Extended interpretation, not religious favor, the aspect of violation of key standard group is conjugate to arguments about both philosophy. First, these are not spiritual philosophies, which means you always read them. I say second, even if they are someone born spiritual, my interpretation doesn't grant that. My interpretation says theological or spiritual, no one can call contemplating spiritual. Third, compare strength to link, even contemplating can be interpreted as spiritual, less spiritual than philosophy like Buddhism or theological philosophy. This cash analysis doesn't answer the interpretation. I'm not saying that Buddhism is religious. I'm saying it's a spiritual philosophy which should be allowed to extend the standard inclusivity. You also concede all my standard level analysis, which takes out a shell of inclusivity, saying that I'm excluded because I don't want to debate against Buddhism. Also, said judgment mentioned they go to insurance of these same judges. Also, we notes about Buddhism, we'd like me to debate this. Also means I always beat his spiritual because he never contested my standard level argumentation, which means he never rejected warrants. So there's no arbitrary claim. He concedes that all the standard arguments.
I had 30 seconds, I think. It'll be wherever you floated the weighing arguments for why his interpretation comes first. Then it'll go to my interpretation, and then if time, the Buddhism stuff.
The weighing, you mean the T stuff?
Yeah, like T comes first.
Okay, gotcha. So T comes first, and then your shell.
And then the Buddhism stuff.
Okay.
Is everybody good? He's making really shitty arguments for why his interpretation comes first, and he's conceding the word from the original interpretation that I wrote. This is why my his number one argument is question of jurisdiction. But first, jurisdiction is not a voter. There is no reason why you give a shit about jurisdiction. People vote in not class all the time. For example, when people read Wilderson affirmative and don't do anything with the resolution, people still vote on it. There's nothing in your history of judging that tells you that you need some sort of rule book for jurisdiction. Also, jurisdiction is only true for pre-agreed rules that are agreed upon before the round. For example, time, which means this is irrelevant. This next argument is forces him to abuse it, but that's only true if substance was impossible. I didn't make substance totally impossible, even if it was difficult to get. It's evident by the fact that he turned the affirmative second. I didn't force you to read an arbitrary plank. This is only true. The way the affirmative was structured was if the only way this is true is if the affirmative was structured so that he would have to read an arbitrary plank. But that's obviously false. His next argument is that the next argument is the interpretation is only about the first shell. But no, if I had to read this interpretation to against the first shell, that still makes it so that I cannot engage in the other interpretations, proving that this is still a higher layer. Second, it's a question of competing interpretations. My interpretation is still functions on a higher layer. It's irrelevant. For example, my interpretation questions the norms of meta theory, and if that's true, that means that even if it's true that, like in this specific case, my interpretation is not about his interpretation, that doesn't matter. Strength of link doesn't matter because I've won that my layer is higher, so you can ignore that way and go to my interpretation. Except my interpretation that you may not read arbitrary plans to the interpretation, but extend the violation that he definitely violates. The analysis that he gives in the last speech is that his plank is not arbitrary because he gives reasons why Buddhism would violate it. But the problem with the interpretation is the abuse story from the last interpretation was reasons as to why you wouldn't be impartial, but there's no independent reason why spiritualism would make you impartial. He's giving you new warrants in the 2 and R as to why Buddhism would cause intervention, but that was definitely not articulated in the last speech also, so you shouldn't give them credence. He should have made the abuse specific to Buddhism, which makes it otherwise it's impossible for me to get this interpretation. Let's go down the interpretation. His first argument is that let's go down the arguments. This is why he solves my interpretation. He said that I can just explain how his arbitrary is playing and it's ununique, but why it's non-unique. But the abuse story comes back that I can't generate offense when you have an arbitrary claim to the interpretation because it just becomes a moot point. It just becomes defensive. You are not understanding the interpretation. Jackson. The next argument he makes is that it's bad for norm creation, but if you vote for this interpretation, but no, if you don't have a single arbitrary claim saying, which you're saying, if you're saying you're perfect, that they'll be for the best norms, it sorts of acts as a filter for interpretations, because it means that you can only read good interprets, which also means that all of his norm weighing is hijacked by my interpretation. His next argument is that this will, his next argument is that he solves, the next argument is that he, let's go to the reasons, I don't know where you flow and why he makes, like, the reason why Buddhism doesn't violate. Extend the card that I read in the last speech was that Buddhism is just an approach to desire production, which means this answers back his warrants for why you'd be impartial, even if you have a Buddhist approach to life. There is literally nothing you will intervene about because it's just a question of thinking processes. The way he articulates interpreting, even in the Shuadar, was how ethical philosophies function. For example, how utilitarians view as suffering would violate this. So, vote for recording.